Presidential elections in the United States are more than just a little weird. Case in point, although Congress has chosen the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November in years divisible by 4 to be the day where, for most practical purposes, campaigning stops and ballots are due, that's not the date that the president is actually elected. That date is, quote, the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December. In the year 2020, that happens to fall on December 14th. And it's the day that the Electoral College meets and its members cast the actual votes for the presidential ticket. If you're wondering how common this kind of system is, here's a map of countries with Electoral College systems like the United States. You know, ones that are used after the popular vote, not involving input from members of the legislature in order to elect their heads of state. Yeah, no, so the answer is not very common at all. It is literally just the United States. Although there are some countries that do have electoral college systems that either elect officials other than the chief executive, have an electoral college that involves members of the legislature, or uses an electoral college without bothering to have the people vote first. Some countries, like Finland and Argentina, used to have electoral colleges but have since replaced them. And it's not like it's without controversy here. The Electoral College has produced a winner that differs from the person cinching the greatest share of the popular vote 5 times: 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016. But in fairness to the Electoral College, judging it by how well it adheres to the popular vote is like judging a basketball by how well you can kick it up and down the pitch. That's not what the designers intended, but it's also very clear that it really wasn't what they had in mind. The reason the Electoral College vote tracks as closely as it does is because, pretty quickly, individual states decided to deviate away from its formative intentions and to more explicitly link the Electoral College vote with the vote that happens in November. But what was that original intention? What was the driving motivation behind the creation of this unique and singular electoral system? Why does the US even have an Electoral College in the first place? Today, we're going to answer those questions, and in the process, we're going to see that the Electoral College is less an instrument of grand, deliberate design and more of the slipshod consequence of multiple competing goals and ideas at play in 1787. So you might have heard that the framers' intention for creating the Electoral College was to prevent some states from being passed over, to stop demagogues from taking office, or to make it so that rural states manage to get a president that addresses their distinctive issues. This is all wrong. Kind of. The thing is, none of the framers actually went to the Constitutional Convention with the Electoral College in mind. If you look at any of the major plans proposed during the convention to structure the government, the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, and even the Connecticut Compromise, none of them use an Electoral College as a means of appointing the president. Rather, it emerged in bits and pieces in response to 3 overarching concerns: representation, slavery, and separation of powers, although those first 2 were very intimately intertwined. The early days of the Constitutional Convention were largely spent trying to figure out how the legislature would be fashioned. The presidency was kind of a secondary consideration. This may seem weird to us today, but back then, Congress was seen as the preeminent branch, or at worst, the first among equals. So an incredible amount of time was spent trying to fashion the structure of the national legislature. Would it be bicameral with a upper and lower house, or unicameral with just a single chamber? How would that chamber be filled, or those chambers be filled? Who would get to elect or appoint the members? And would representation there be based equally among the states, or in proportion to populations and or economic output? With the benefit of, only a couple centuries of hindsight, the answer seems pretty obvious to us, but at the time, these were far more controversial issues. The convention almost dissolved multiple times over them, specifically the ones over how many representatives the states would have in the new legislature. One thing that was in broad agreement, though, was at least one chamber would grant representation proportional to something? Something that represents the state's overall contribution to the Union. But there were debates over how that contribution should be conceptualized. Raw population, numbers of citizens, tax revenues, economic outputs more broadly. You can see this tension in some of the earliest mentions at the convention about the debates of representation in Congress. One of the architects of the Virginia Plan initially argued, quote, that the rights of suffrage in the national legislature ought to be proportioned as the quotas of contribution, or the numbers of free inhabitants, as one or the other rule may seem best in different cases. Why might economic contributions be best in some cases while population in others? Well, in many of the southern, more agrarian states, forcibly enslaved peoples represented anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of the state's overall population. Obviously, their enslavers weren't keen on giving them legal rights, but said slavers also wanted the various forms of power that could be extracted from slave labor, and that included formal political power in the new union. So they were inclined towards weighting representation by economic output, because if they entered the Union without counting their enslaved populations for something, they were afraid that the other states would overrule them and eventually make slavery itself illegal. God forbid. Resolution to this was the infamous Three-Fifths Compromise. Membership in the lower chamber would be based upon state population, and enslaved peoples would count for 3/5 of a single person. With this settled, the framers went on to spend the next few weeks wrestling over representation, which again almost brought the convention to a screeching halt. That eventually was resolved, though, through the Connecticut Compromise, which made one house, the House of Representatives, be apportioned based upon the population calculated with the Three-Fifths Compromise in mind, and made another, the Senate, apportioned with 2 representatives per state. Once that was eked out, the framers then had to turn their attention to how the chief magistrate, what we would now call the president, was elected. I know that all seems kind of like not topical and ingermane to the question of presidential elections, but I promise we'll get back to that in like 3 or 4 minutes. Despite what you might have otherwise heard, it wasn't as if all of the founders were totally against the popular vote. From Madison's notes at the convention, quote, James Wilson of Pennsylvania would say, however, that at least in theory he was for an election by the people. Experience, particularly in New York and Massachusetts, showed that an election of the first magistrate by the people at large was both a convenient and successful mode. It is more accurate to say, though, that most of the pro-democracy proponents were ambivalent at best to the prospect, and most of the detractors were immensely skeptical. Elridge Gerry, leader of the committee that hammered out the Connecticut Compromise, noted that, quote, he was against a popular election. The people were uninformed and would be misled by a few designing men. But there was another thing stopping people from taking on a more pro-democracy attitude. Slavery. The southern states had a lot of power in Congress now due to the Three-Fifths Compromise, but that power would be virtually worthless in a direct election because it was unthinkable to them to allow their slaves to have the political power to vote. And they weren't about to have power in one chamber but surrender it in another other branch of government. As James Madison argued, quote, there was one difficulty, however, of a serious nature attending an immediate choice by the people. The right of suffrage was much more diffusive in the northern than the southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of the Negroes. Basically, a popular vote would be a non-starter in the South because the agrarian states wanted to maximize their clout in the new government. They wanted slaves to and not to count when it suited them. And because many of the other delegates prioritized unity and felt that slavery was an antiquated economic model that would be gradually phased out on its own, the issue really wasn't pushed all that much more. And that decision to kick the can down the road certainly wouldn't blow up in their face over the next few decades. So the direct elections wouldn't work because racism and elitism won the day at the convention, although again, not without some contestation. So why didn't they just have Congress appoint a chief executive like in most parliamentary systems? Well, here's where we get to the third part of the equation, separation of powers. We talked about this a little bit on the channel when we discussed why Supreme Court justices preside for life. The founders built a system on the overarching worldview that people were flawed and ambitious, but that the best way to prevent ambitious people from becoming tyrants was to combat each other through competition. The executive, judiciary, and legislature would all have generally distinct areas of power, but with enough overlap that expansion by one would be encroachment into the others. And ideally, the others would not stand idly by as their power was consolidated by other actors. They'd put up a fight and stop them. This is the idea of ambition counteracting ambition. So the framers felt that it'd be incredibly problematic for one of those branches, Congress, to have such an integral role in the creation and maintenance of one of the other major branches. Indeed, the framers actually flirted with the idea of congressional appointments, but it broke down when, among other things, they tackled the issue of the chief magistrate seeking office multiple times. They worried that making a congressionally appointed president eligible for multiple terms meant that the latter would spend most of the time kissing up to the former. So they decided on creating a temporary Congress, one that forms and disbands every 4 years with the singular purpose of electing the president. These members would be explicitly forbidden from holding any other federal office, and the time from when they'd be appointed to when they'd have to cast their vote would be too short to be effectively lobbied by either Congress or the presidential aspirants. This idea was, as you could probably surmise, the Electoral College, although they wouldn't come to actually call it by that name for a few decades. Okay, but how did they pick the formula that they chose for how many electors each state would get? Representation. See, I told you we'd come back around to it. We just kind of took the scenic route. So by this point, the framers have decided on using electors directed by the states. But how many did each state get? a flat 25 apiece, varying ratios due to state size or clout, or ratios conjured up entirely out of their butts because they just kind of felt that Georgia should have at least 2. And by the way, those are all real. They spent weeks going back and forth on the specific numbers, qualifications, and means of appointing electors. It was like the representation debates all over again. So they eventually just tabled it with a bunch of other intractable issues and were basically just like, we'll figure that out eventually. That eventually would come in the form of the Brearley Committee, or as it was also called, I kid you not, the Committee on Postponed Parts. Just shows to go that no one is above the siren song of procrastination. That committee hammered out the idea of the Electoral College as we have it today. Quote, each state shall appoint in such manner as its legislature may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and members of the House of Representatives to which the state may be entitled in the legislature. And by and large, this was rather enthusiastically picked up by the framers because it satisfied all of the criteria that had emerged during the debates. States were the ones holding the power, not the people or federal officials, and numbers would reflect the state's overall presence in the national government as distinctive entities. Indeed, many historians feel that the framers were most proud of this part of the Constitution than virtually any other part. They saw it as an overwhelming success. Until James Madison himself tried to lobby for an amendment just like 40 years later because the college had just gone completely off the rail with its winner-take-all system. So yeah, even the people who made it would ultimately come to view it with some mixed feelings. Just so we're clear, what I've presented here is a narrativized version of the events in 1787. Things didn't always proceed so linearly. For example, once the founders had decided on electors not being made up by members of the national legislature, they went back to that idea for a few days before rejecting it again. This was very much a 3 steps forward and 2 steps back kind of deal. But all the twists and turns culminated in the system that we have today. It's not perfect. It wasn't even perfect by the standards of the time. But it does have a reason behind its conception. It may not be the one that people commonly think it is, and it may very well be that those reasons are now irrelevant and outmoded, but it's important to know what they were in the first place. I'm curious to see what you guys think about all of this, so drop some comments down below. I'm looking forward to reading all of them and responding to a few at the end of the next video. And if you enjoyed this video, I hope you consider liking it and sharing it, and if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more videos on our endlessly fascinating social world. A huge thank you to the supporters of the channel on Patreon, including Joel and Tim Northrup, who are this video's research assistants. Every bit helps me buy the books, newspaper subscriptions, and coffee that makes these videos. Lots of coffee. All the coffee. And I'm sincerely grateful for all of y'all's support of the channel. And if you'd like to contribute to the channel, patrons get early content, your name on the end card, or a shout out. So if you're able to help out, you can click the link down in the doobly-doo or at the end card at the end of the video. I sincerely appreciate it. Last time we talked about October surprises and what kinds of effects they've had in the past and how hard it is to study the idea in general. And let's see what you guys had to say about that. So Tempo Dude brought up the idea of Israel and how, just a single speech can seem to have brought up, the new prime minister's election. Just a single thing, a small thing, can carry forward and have these consequences. And by and large, I'm not trying to say that October surprises are impossible or that they don't exist, more that it's very, very difficult to be able to find out whether or not they truly did or didn't, right? Like, as an aggregate phenomenon, it's very, very difficult to kind of pin down, even if you can, point to individual examples. And some of these individual examples do have solid empirical backing. But it's also the case that sometimes they're just easy stories to tell. They seem like they're believable. They follow a narrative construct that's very familiar to us. So I don't know, I'm not saying that October surprises don't happen. What I am saying is that it's damn hard to be able to back those up with any kind of evidence, quantitative, qualitative, what have you. Malarkey. So yeah, I did bring it up. If you go back to the video and freeze frame it about here, you can see that I mentioned that the biggest difference between Biden and Clinton email stories was largely issues of credibility. Although, yeah, point taken, I could have probably just said that out loud, but I didn't really want to dwell on it in too long and inflame and amplify what many people left and right saw as a baseless conspiracy theory. So Intellectual Magician asked, whether or not it's the magnitude of an event that matters more or the proximity of an event that matters more. And, and said that, it's probably going to be a little bit of both. And I think that's, 100% spot on. I swear, if I ever make merch, the very first thing I'm making is a mug that says social science, where the answer to everything is a resounding, maybe, I don't know, it depends. So first off, we have to remember, right, that these are generally constructed phenomena, right? So an event has to happen, it has to be picked up by the media, the framing has to be a certain way in terms of the framing of the magnitude, and then people have to accept this framing. So there has to be a lot of moving parts into like what is discerned to be a large event. But given that it is, I think proximity probably plays the bigger role. In my mind, it's kind of like golfing, right? So when you're on the putting green, how you align your ball in order to get into the hole, or maybe just putt even, right? Either of them. How you align your ball matters, but speed is the more important factor, right? Because if you have the alignment right, but you don't have the speed, you're either going to come up too short, or you're just going to blow right through the break. So yeah, I think that both will matter, because if you just have something absolutely massive that happens 2 years before, they're not shaking it. But at the same time, you know, if you have a number of smaller events, I think proximity to the election is going to be the thing that matters the most. That's all the time that I have for comments in this video. So thank you guys so much for writing them down, and please, please, please keep them coming. I sincerely appreciate the time and the effort that you guys takes to write those out. Sources for everything has always been down in the do-we-do, as well as links to Twitter and the blog. I look forward to seeing you guys out there as well. If you enjoyed this video, just as a reminder, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by commenting down below, by sharing this video, and by subscribing to the channel for more awesome social science content. And don't forget to hit the bell, that way you're guaranteed to be in the loop when I upload new videos. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.